Call for the doctor. The telephone was ringing beside Dr. Page's bed. As he reached out his hand to answer it, he noticed the time, 3:15 in the morning. Someone must be very ill to call a doctor at a time like that.
Dr. Page here,
he said.
Oh, doctor, I'm so glad you're awake. I've got a terrible pain and I'm so afraid. Do you please come quickly?
Who is speaking, please?
It's Mrs. Manners, 43 Grove Road. You will come at once, won't you?
Well, Mrs. Manners, can you tell me a little more about your pain?
Oh dear, I'm too ill to talk. Please, doctor.
Very well, I'll come,
said the doctor. He began putting on his clothes.
I don't know when I'll be back,
he said to his sleepy wife.
If it's something serious, I may be out all night.
Grove Road was on the opposite side of the town, but at this hour of the night the streets were empty, and he was able to drive quickly. Number 43 was a small house, near the end of the road. The door had been left open for him, and he walked in. Mrs. Manners was sitting up in bed. She was a large woman of about 50.
Oh, doctor, I'm so glad you've come. I have some good news for you. The pain hasn't come again and I'm feeling very much better.
Oh, are you? Now, tell me where it hurts.
He moved his hand over her body, pressing carefully, first in one place and then in another. Then he stood up.
Well, Mr. Manners, I can't find anything wrong. Perhaps it was something you've eaten that gave you a pain.
I did have rather a large dinner last night, and perhaps I ate too much of that nice cake. Well, it's so nice to know there's nothing wrong with me.
Dr. Page did not smile.
Perhaps another time, Mrs. Manners, you will make sure there is something wrong before calling me out in the middle of the night.
Oh dear, I'm so sorry. But you know, I'm sure that what really made me feel better was the sound of your voice on the telephone. So kind, so firm.
Goodbye, Mrs. Manners.
The doctor's wife was very angry when she heard that there was nothing really wrong with Mrs. Manners.
You work hard all day,
she said.
And you can't even get any rest at night. You shouldn't go when people call you in the middle of the night.
One never knows. It may be something serious.
3 weeks later, Mrs. Manners rang up again. This time it was 11 o'clock in the evening, and Dr. Page was just getting ready for bed.
Doctor, I've cut my arm. I was cutting some wood for the fire and my hand slipped. The blood is rushing out and I can't stop it.
Tie something round it to stop the blood,
said Dr. Page.
I'll be there in 15 minutes.
Why does she want to cut firewood at this time of night?
said his wife. She was still up when the doctor returned from Mrs. Manners's house.
Well,
she said.
Did she really need a doctor?
It wasn't a very deep cut. She hadn't really lost very much blood.
Perhaps not, but you've lost a lot of sleep.
The next telephone call from Mrs. Manners came at 10 o'clock in the morning.
I've got a very bad cold, doctor,
she said.
And now I feel most unwell. I should be very glad if you could come round today.
He visited Mrs. Manners in the afternoon, and found her quite ill.
Is there no one who can come and look after you for a few days?
He said.
You ought not to be all alone here.
I'll find out if my sister can come. Oh dear, doctor, am I very bad?
Oh, it's nothing serious. You should be well again in a few days. I'll come round and see you again tomorrow.
But the doctor was not really very surprised when his telephone rang at 1 o'clock that night. His wife answered it.
It's Mrs. Manners.
She said.
She thinks she's dying.
Dr. Page hurried round to Grove Road. Mrs. Manners smiled brightly at him.
As soon as I know you were coming, doctor, I began to feel so much better. Before I rang up, I really did feel very strange. Of course, I wouldn't have brought you here for nothing. Well, it's a good thing that my sister will be here this afternoon.
It certainly is a good thing.
The doctor looked tired when he got up next morning.
You can't go on like this,
said his wife angrily.
If that Mrs. Manners rings you up again in the middle of the night, let her wait till the morning.
I can't do that. Suppose she really was seriously ill? Then if she died, it would be my fault. After all, a doctor must expect broken nights.
Dr. Page had another broken night 10 days later. He was called out in the middle of the night to a woman who was having a baby. His work was finished at 4 o'clock in the morning, and he drove home through the quiet, empty streets. Suddenly he noticed that he was driving along Grove Road, and an idea came into his head. He stopped the car outside number 43, and beat loudly on the door. After a few minutes he heard the sound of running footsteps.
Who is it? What do you want?
Mrs. Manners' voice sounded afraid.
It's Dr. Page.
She opened the door then. She had pulled a coat round her, but she looked only half awake.
What is wrong, doctor? Why have you come here at this hour?
Dr. Page smiled pleasantly.
Oh, I happened to be passing, and I thought I'd visit you and see how you were getting on. Are you quite better now?
Yes, thank you. But really, doctor, I can't understand why you should wake me up at 4 o'clock in the morning, just to ask how I am. It's a terrible time to be woken up.
Yes, it is, isn't it? I'm glad you think so too. Goodbye, Mrs. Manners.
After this, Dr. Page had no more night calls from Mrs. Manners.